On the afternoon of February 18th, 2001, at approximately 3:15 p.m., FBI Special Agent Robert Philip Hanssen drove his dark blue sedan through the quiet residential streets of Vienna, Virginia, heading toward Foxstone Park. The temperature that Sunday afternoon hovered around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with overcast skies that threatened rain but had not yet delivered. Hanssen, 56 years old, had worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 25 years, specializing in Soviet and Russian counterintelligence, the very area in which he had secretly betrayed his country for more than 2 decades. In the trunk of his vehicle, wrapped in a black plastic garbage bag, was a package containing 7 classified documents he intended to leave at a dead-drop site he had used many times before. He had no way of knowing that more than 40 FBI agents were watching his every move, that his career, his freedom, and the carefully constructed double life he had maintained since 1979 were about to end within the next 20 minutes. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's examine how a trusted FBI officer became the most damaging spy in American history. Robert Philip Hanssen had been born on April 18, 1944, in Chicago, Illinois, to Howard and Vivian Hanssen. His father, Howard, was a Chicago police officer. According to later accounts from family members and people who knew the family, Howard maintained an emotionally distant and often critical relationship with his son. Howard Hanssen had wanted Robert to follow him into law enforcement, but their relationship was marked by tension and, Robert would later claim, by his father's perpetual disappointment in him. Vivian Hanssen worked as a homemaker. The family lived in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side, in a modest house where Howard's authority was absolute and where expressions of affection were rare. Robert attended William Howard Taft High School in Chicago, where classmates remembered him as intelligent but socially awkward, more comfortable with books and academic work than with the social dynamics of adolescence. He graduated in 1962 and enrolled at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, where he studied chemistry and Russian. The decision to study Russian was motivated by the Cold War context of the early 1960s and by what Hanssen himself described as a fascination with Soviet culture and ideology. He graduated from Knox College in 1966 with a Bachelor of Arts degree and then attended Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, earning an MBA in Accounting and Information Systems in 1976. During his time at Northwestern, Hanssen worked part-time as an investigator for the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, a position that allowed him to follow, at least partially, in his father's footsteps while maintaining his own distinct path. He worked on cases involving police misconduct and corruption, reviewing evidence, conducting interviews, and preparing reports. Colleagues from this period would later describe him as meticulous, detail-oriented, and someone who preferred working alone rather than as part of a team, characteristics that would define his entire professional life. In 1968, while still at Northwestern, Robert had met Bernadette Bonnie Wauck at a charitable event organized by the Catholic organization Opus Dei, to which both belonged. Bonnie came from a large Catholic family in the Chicago area. Her father, Leroy Wauck, was a professor. She was deeply religious, committed to the conservative Catholic values promoted by Opus Dei, and, according to people who knew her, gentle and somewhat sheltered from the world beyond her family and church community. Robert and Bonnie married in 1968. Their first child, a son, was born in 1971. Over the following years, they would have 5 more children, 6 in total, who would grow up never suspecting what their father was doing in the shadows of their family life. In 1976, immediately after completing his MBA, Robert Hanssen applied to the FBI and was accepted into the Bureau's training program at Quantico, Virginia. His background in accounting, information systems, and his time working internal affairs for the Chicago police made him an attractive candidate. He completed his training and received his first assignment to the FBI's Gary, Indiana field office, where he worked on white-collar crime cases and public corruption investigations. According to FBI personnel records, Hanssen was competent but not exceptional during his early years. He completed his assignments, wrote thorough reports, and demonstrated analytical skills, but he did not stand out among his peers as someone destined for rapid advancement. In 1978, after approximately 2 years in Gary, Hanssen requested and received a transfer to the FBI's New York field office, where he was assigned to a unit focused on Soviet counterintelligence operations. This assignment placed him in one of the Bureau's most sensitive areas, monitoring and investigating Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States, tracking suspected Soviet intelligence assets, and working to protect American secrets from foreign adversaries. Hanssen, with his background in Russian language and his analytical skills, seemed well suited to the work. His colleagues in New York would later describe him as knowledgeable about Soviet intelligence methods and someone who preferred working alone or in small groups rather than in larger teams. The Hanssen family, Robert, Bonnie, and their growing number of children, lived in Scarsdale, New York, in a modest house that Bonnie worked to make into a proper Catholic home. She homeschooled the children for several years, following Opus Dei's emphasis on traditional education and religious instruction. Robert commuted to Manhattan for work. To neighbors and fellow parishioners at their Catholic church, the Hanssens appeared to be a conventional, if unusually religious and private family. Robert rarely spoke about his work, explaining that FBI regulations and the classified nature of his assignments prevented him from discussing cases at home. And Bonnie rarely questioned him, accepting his explanations and focusing her attention on the children and household. What no one knew, not Bonnie, not his children, not his colleagues, not his supervisors, was that in November 1979, Robert Hanssen made contact with Soviet intelligence and began providing classified information to the Soviet Union. The decision to commit espionage developed over a period of months during 1979. According to Hanssen's later statements to FBI investigators and to the psychiatrists who evaluated him after his arrest, multiple factors contributed to his decision. Financial pressure was significant. Supporting 6 children on an FBI salary was difficult, and particularly with Bonnie's preference for Catholic private schools and Robert's own expensive tastes in technology and computer equipment. Resentment fueled him. Hanssen believed he was smarter than his supervisors and colleagues, but was not receiving the recognition, promotions, or assignments he deserved. Intellectual arrogance played a central role. He believed he could outwit the FBI's security systems and that his knowledge of counterintelligence methods would allow him to operate without detection. And there was also, according to his own later admissions, a perverse thrill in the act of betrayal itself, the secret knowledge that he was deceiving everyone around him, that he was operating at a level of complexity that no one suspected. The initial contact occurred through a letter Hanssen sent to a GRU officer in New York, whose identity he had learned through his counterintelligence work. The letter, which Hanssen typed on a portable typewriter to avoid any connection to FBI equipment, offered to provide information in exchange for payment. He did not sign his real name, instead using the pseudonym Ramon or Ramon Garcia, a name he would use in all his communications with Soviet and later Russian intelligence throughout his 22 years of espionage. The letter included enough specific information to demonstrate that Hanssen had access to valuable intelligence and also established his requirements. He wanted payment in cash. He wanted the exchanges to be conducted through dead drops rather than in-person meetings to minimize the risk of detection. And he insisted on complete anonymity. The Soviets would never know his real identity, his position, or any personal details that could compromise him if their records were ever obtained by American intelligence. The Soviets responded positively to Hanssen's offer. Over the following months, in late 1979 and early 1980, Hanssen began providing documents. The dead drop method worked as follows. Hanssen would receive instructions, delivered through encrypted messages and signals, indicating when and where to leave information or retrieve payment. The locations were typically in parks or wooded areas in Virginia or Maryland, places where a person could walk without attracting attention, and where a package could be concealed under a bridge, in a drainage pipe, or beneath a particular tree. On a cold morning in March 1980, Hanssen executed one of his early dead drop operations that would establish his pattern for the next 2 decades. He left his house in Scarsdale at 6:15 a.m., telling Bonnie he needed to drive into the city early for a meeting. Instead, he drove to Nottoway Park in Vienna, Virginia, a location the Soviets had designated through their encrypted communications system. The park was nearly empty at that hour. Hanssen parked near the main entrance and retrieved a manila envelope from beneath his car seat. Inside were photographs of 3 classified documents detailing FBI surveillance techniques used against Soviet diplomats in New York. He walked along a trail for approximately 8 minutes until he reached a wooden footbridge crossing a small creek. He stopped, looked around to ensure no one was watching, then knelt as if tying his shoe. In one smooth motion, he taped the envelope to the underside of the bridge railing, where it would be invisible to anyone passing by. He returned to his car and drove to the FBI's New York office, arriving in time for his shift. That evening, a Soviet intelligence officer retrieved the envelope. 3 days later, Hanssen found a package containing $6,000 in $20 bills at another location the Soviets had designated. The intelligence Hanssen provided to the Soviets during these early years included details about FBI counterintelligence operations, the identities of FBI officers working on Soviet cases, and technical information about FBI surveillance methods. The Soviets paid him in cash, on leaving packages of bills at dead drop sites that Hanssen would retrieve during carefully planned operations designed to avoid detection. He understood the game he was playing. He needed to remain valuable to his Soviet handlers while not causing the kind of damage that would force the FBI to implement security measures that might detect him. Then, in the spring of 1980, Hanssen's espionage activity came to an abrupt halt, not because he was caught, but because his wife discovered it. The discovery occurred on a Saturday afternoon in May 1980. Bonnie had been searching for a box of old photographs in the bedroom closet when she noticed something unusual, a leather portfolio tucked behind Robert's suits that she had never seen before. She opened it and found stacks of $20 bills, neatly bundled. She counted the money. It totaled more than $5,000. Her hands shook as she held the cash. Robert's FBI salary was modest. They struggled to make ends meet with 6 children. Where had this money come from? She sat on the edge of the bed, the portfolio in her lap, and tried to think of innocent explanations. An inheritance he had not mentioned? A bonus from work? But why would he hide it? When Robert came home that evening, Bonnie confronted him in their bedroom with the portfolio open on the bed between them. According to her later statements to the FBI, Robert's face went pale. He tried deflection first, claiming the money was from selling computer equipment from consulting work he had done on the side. But Bonnie, who rarely challenged her husband, pressed him with uncharacteristic insistence. She demanded the truth. Robert sat down heavily in the chair by the window. For several minutes he said nothing. Then he told her he had been providing information to the Soviets. Bonnie felt the room spin. She asked him what kind of information. Robert claimed it was nothing important, nothing that could hurt anyone, just minor material that the Soviets probably already knew from other sources. He told her he had only done it a few times. He told her it was over, that he had already stopped. He expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse. He asked for her forgiveness and her prayers. Bonnie Hanssen faced an impossible choice. She could report her husband to the FBI, which would result in his arrest, the destruction of their family, and the scandal and shame that would fall upon her and their 6 children. Or she could remain silent, accept his assurance that it was over, and try to move forward. She sat on the bed and wept. She prayed. She thought about her children. She thought about her faith's teaching on marriage and forgiveness. After what felt like hours, but was perhaps only 30 minutes, she made her decision. She would not report him. But she insisted on one condition. Robert must confess to an Opus Dei priest and seek spiritual counsel. Robert agreed. He met with an Opus Dei priest, though what he actually confessed to the priest, if anything specific about espionage, remains unclear. The priest counseled repentance and restitution. Robert told Bonnie that he had confessed his wrongdoing and that the priest had advised him to make amends. He claimed to have donated the money to Mother Teresa's charity, though investigators would later find no evidence this actually occurred. Bonnie, who had no reason to doubt her husband and who desperately wanted to believe the crisis was over, accepted his account. For approximately 5 years, from 1980 to 1985, Robert Hanssen did not engage in espionage. During this period, he continued his work at the FBI, maintained his family life, and appeared, at least to Bonnie and to those around him, to have resolved whatever crisis had led him to betray his country. In 1981, Hanssen received a transfer to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he was assigned to the Soviet Analytical Unit within the Intelligence Division. This position gave him access to an even broader range of classified information about FBI operations against Soviet intelligence, including details about human sources, technical surveillance operations, and counterintelligence investigations. The Hanssen family moved to a house in Vienna, Virginia, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where families with children were common, and where Robert and Bonnie could continue raising their children in accordance with their religious values. The house was a modest split level with a small yard where the children played and a basement where Robert established what he called his office, a space filled with computers, communications equipment, and the technological gadgets he constantly acquired. Bonnie continued to devote herself to the children and to her religious practices. The family attended Mass regularly. To their neighbors, the Hanssens were private and somewhat unusual. Robert was socially awkward, Bonnie extremely sheltered, but not remarkable. In 1985, Robert Hanssen resumed his espionage activities, driven by many of the same factors that had motivated him initially: financial pressure, resentment of his treatment at work, intellectual arrogance, and the thrill of deception. By 1985, Hanssen had become aware through his counterintelligence work that other Americans were spying for the Soviet Union and were receiving substantial payments. The year 1985 would become known in the intelligence community as the Year of the Spy because of the number of American spies who were active or who were caught during that period. Hanssen rationalized his return to espionage in part by reasoning that if others were doing it and profiting from it, his own earlier espionage had not been unusually terrible, and his resumption of it would not be either. P. Hanssen's method of reinitiating contact with Soviet intelligence was characteristically cautious. When he resumed in 1985, he sent a letter to Victor Cherkashin at the KGB's Counterintelligence Division in Washington, once again using the pseudonym Ramon, indicating that he was prepared to resume providing information. The Soviets, who had maintained records of their previous relationship with Ramon and who had valued the intelligence he had provided during 1979 to 1980, responded eagerly. A new system of dead drops and communications was established. Hanssen began providing information at a significantly increased level compared to his earlier espionage. The intelligence Hanssen provided to the Soviet Union between 1985 and 1991, the period when the Soviet Union still existed and the KGB was still functioning as the Soviet intelligence service, was extraordinarily damaging to U.S. national security. Among the most catastrophic compromises, Hanssen identified 3 Soviet intelligence officers who were secretly working for the United States. General Dmitri Polyakov, a high-ranking GRU officer, had been one of the CIA's most valuable sources for nearly 2 decades. Operating under the code name Top Hat, Polyakov had provided critical intelligence about Soviet military capabilities, strategic intentions, and the identities of Soviet intelligence officers operating abroad. He had volunteered his services to American intelligence out of disillusionment with the Soviet system and had risked his life for years to provide information that shaped U.S. military and strategic planning. The intelligence Polyakov provided helped American policymakers understand Soviet missile technology, military doctrine, and strategic thinking during some of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Hanssen's exposure of Polyakov led to his arrest by Soviet authorities in 1986. He was interrogated, tried in secret, and executed by firing squad in 1988. His wife and children were persecuted by Soviet authorities, stripped of their privileges, and subjected to surveillance and harassment for years afterward. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martynov, 2 KGB officers who were serving as FBI sources in Washington, D.C., were also exposed by Hanssen's information. Both men had been providing the FBI with valuable intelligence about KGB operations in the United States. Both were recalled to Moscow under false pretenses, arrested upon arrival, interrogated, and executed. Their families suffered consequences similar to Polyakov's: loss of status, persecution, and the lifelong burden of being related to traitors in a society that showed little mercy to such connections. Hanssen provided the KGB with detailed information about a secret tunnel the FBI had constructed under the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The tunnel, part of an operation that had cost tens of millions of dollars and had taken years to construct, was designed to allow the FBI to tap into Soviet communications systems. Pana engineers had dug beneath the embassy using specialized equipment that operated silently to avoid detection. The tunnel's existence was one of the FBI's most closely guarded secrets, known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Hanssen's revelation of the tunnel's existence in 1987 forced the FBI to abandon the operation immediately. Years of planning, millions of dollars in investment, and untold intelligence value were lost. The Soviets not only stopped using the communications systems the tunnel was designed to monitor, but also used the knowledge of the tunnel's existence to feed disinformation through channels they knew the Americans were monitoring. Hanssen compromised numerous FBI and CIA technical operations designed to gather intelligence on Soviet activities. This included information about surveillance techniques, electronic monitoring capabilities, encrypted communications methods, and the technical means used to detect Soviet intelligence activities. Each piece of technical intelligence Hanssen provided allowed the Soviets to develop countermeasures, rendering American capabilities less effective and forcing intelligence agencies to invest in new technologies and methods. Hanssen provided the Soviets with copies of the FBI's double agent program reports, which detailed how the FBI ran operations using Soviet intelligence officers who had agreed to work for the United States. These reports contained operational details, assessment of sources, and strategic plans. This information allowed the KGB to assess which of their officers might be compromised and to take countermeasures, including reassigning officers, implementing additional security protocols, or in some cases, eliminating suspected traitors. The impact of these compromises extended beyond the specific operations and individuals involved. Each piece of intelligence Hanssen provided gave Soviet intelligence a clearer picture of American capabilities, methods, and vulnerabilities. The exposure and execution of officers like Polyakov, Motorin, and Martynov not only eliminated valuable sources, but also sent a chilling message to any Soviet intelligence officer who might have been considering cooperation with the United States. Betrayal would be discovered and would be punished with death. Throughout this period, from 1985 onward, Robert Hanssen maintained his position at FBI headquarters, working on the very counterintelligence issues he was actively undermining. Colleagues continued to see the same pattern that had characterized him since high school: intelligent, socially awkward, preferring to work alone. He could be condescending to people he viewed as less intelligent, often preferred to work independently, and had strong opinions about how investigations should be conducted. But nothing about his work performance or his behavior raised suspicions of espionage. He completed his assignments, contributed to meetings, trained newer agents in counterintelligence methods, and maintained the appearance of a dedicated FBI employee. The payments Hanssen received from the Soviets and later from the Russians were substantial. Between 1979 and 2001, he received more than $1.4 million in cash and diamonds, with some estimates placing the total as high as $2.2 million when including the assessed value of diamonds. The money was delivered through the dead drop system, packages left at prearranged locations, which Hanssen would retrieve and bring home. He could not deposit large sums in bank accounts without triggering scrutiny, so he kept much of the cash hidden in various locations around his house. He used some of the money for daily expenses, which allowed him to maintain a lifestyle somewhat beyond what his FBI salary would have supported. He purchased expensive computer equipment, paid for family expenses, and spent significant sums on a relationship with a Washington, D.C. stripper named Priscilla Sue Gailey. The relationship with Gailey revealed another dimension of Hanssen's psychology: his desperate need for validation and admiration. He gave her money, bought her a Mercedes-Benz, and spent hours talking with her about his work and his life, though he never revealed his espionage activities. She represented someone who admired him, who thought he was important and impressive, who provided the ego gratification that he craved but did not receive from his wife or his colleagues. The relationship was not primarily sexual, but rather psychological. Hanssen needed someone to recognize his intelligence and his significance, and Gailey, who accepted his gifts and listened to his stories, fulfilled that need. Bonnie Hanssen had no knowledge of her husband's resumed espionage activities after 1980 or of his relationship with Gailey. She believed that the 1980 incident had been an aberration, that Robert had genuinely repented, and that the matter was resolved. She did notice that Robert seemed to have more money available for household expenses than his FBI salary would suggest, but when she raised questions, Robert explained it through plausible stories about bonuses, overtime pay, or selling computer equipment. Bonnie, who was trusting by nature and who had no experience with financial matters beyond household budgeting, accepted these explanations. Her focus remained on her children and her religious life. She was not suspicious by nature and had no framework for understanding that her husband might be engaged in systematic betrayal of his country. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For many Americans working in counterintelligence, this represented the end of the Cold War threat and a dramatic shift in the geopolitical landscape. For Robert Hanssen, it represented merely a transition. The KGB was dissolved, and its functions were divided among several successor agencies, including the SVR for External Intelligence and the FSB for Internal Security. Hanssen made contact with the SVR and arranged to continue his espionage relationship, now providing intelligence to post-Soviet Russia rather than to the Soviet Union. The operational methods remained the same: dead drops, encrypted communications, cash payments. The substance of the intelligence he provided also remained similar: information about FBI and CIA operations, technical capabilities, and counterintelligence investigations. The continuation of Hanssen's espionage into the 1990s occurred in a changed context. Due with the Cold War officially over, there was less emphasis on counterintelligence and more focus within the FBI on domestic crimes, terrorism, and other priorities. The FBI's counterintelligence division was smaller, had fewer resources, and received less attention from leadership. This environment made it even easier for Hanssen to operate without detection. There were fewer resources devoted to the kind of internal security reviews that might have caught anomalies in his behavior or finances. During the 1990s, Hanssen received several assignments that gave him continued access to highly sensitive information. From 1992 to 1995, he worked in the FBI's Inspection Division, in which gave him insight into the Bureau's internal security measures and counterintelligence investigations, information he could use to assess whether any investigations were getting close to detecting him. From 1995 to 2000, he worked in the FBI's new Computer Security Unit, where he had access to some of the Bureau's most sensitive databases and communications. In 2000, he was assigned to serve as liaison between the FBI and the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions, a position that involved less access to highly classified counterintelligence material, but which kept him within the security community. Throughout these assignments, Hanssen continued to provide information to the Russians. The FBI's later damage assessment, compiled after his arrest, concluded that between 1991 and 2001, Hanssen had provided more than 6,000 pages of documents and 26 computer disks containing classified information. The material included details about U.S. nuclear war plans, intelligence about Russian activities that the U.S. had obtained through various sources, information about FBI and CIA surveillance capabilities and methods, and assessments of Russian intelligence officers and their activities in the United States. The investigation that would eventually expose Hanssen began not with FBI detective work, but with a purchase. In late 2000, a Russian intelligence officer, whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, but who was motivated by financial considerations and by grievances against his own service, approached American intelligence with an offer to sell a file. The file, he claimed, then contained the complete KGB and SVR records of an American spy who had been providing information for years. The asking price was $7 million. An enormous sum, but one that reflected the potential value of the information if it was genuine. The CIA officer who received the initial approach was skeptical. The intelligence community had been burned before by fabricated information sold by con artists claiming to have access to Russian secrets. But the Russian officer provided samples, copies of letters, operational details, payment records, that suggested the material was authentic. The CIA conducted preliminary authentication and determined that the file, if complete, could identify one of the most damaging spies in American history. The negotiation took weeks. The Russian officer, operating through intermediaries to protect his identity, demanded payment in cash and guarantees of resettlement in the United States. The CIA agreed to his terms. In November 2000, in a carefully orchestrated exchange at a location outside Russia, American intelligence officers received a thick folder containing documents, photographs, and a cassette tape recording. They opened the file in a secure room and began reading. Within minutes, they realized they had obtained something extraordinary. The file contained letters Ramon had written to Soviet and Russian intelligence over more than 2 decades. It contained operational plans, dead drop locations, payment records showing more than $1.4 million had been paid over 22 years, and a recording of a conversation between Ramon and his handlers. The recording was of poor quality, but voice analysis suggested that Ramon was an American male, probably middle-aged, with no particular regional accent. The file did not contain the spy's real name. Ramon had successfully maintained his anonymity throughout his espionage career, and the Russian intelligence services had respected his insistence on operating without their knowing his true identity. The CIA turned the file over to the FBI, and in late 2000, the FBI established a small task force to identify Ramon. The investigation was highly classified. Only a handful of people within the FBI knew about it, because the possibility that Ramon was an FBI employee meant that news of the investigation could easily reach him and allow him to flee or to destroy evidence. The initial phase of the investigation focused on analyzing everything in the file to develop a profile of Ramon. The letters he had written demonstrated high intelligence, familiarity with intelligence tradecraft, and knowledge of both FBI and CIA operations. The recording provided a voice sample. The documents he had provided could be traced to determine who had access to them. The payments documented in the file suggested someone who had been operating for a long time and who had provided consistently valuable intelligence. FBI investigators developed a list of possible suspects, FBI and CIA employees who had the necessary access to the information that had been compromised, who had been in positions of trust during the relevant time periods, and who fit the general profile suggested by the Ramon file. The list contained dozens of names. In late 2000 or very early 2001, a breakthrough occurred. FBI technical specialists analyzing the audio recording from the Ramon file identified distinctive speech patterns and phrasing that, when compared against voice samples collected from potential suspects during normal work activities, produced a match. The voice on the recording belonged to Robert Philip Hanssen. The FBI's leadership faced a difficult decision: arrest Hanssen immediately based on the evidence they had, or conduct additional surveillance to gather more evidence and to ensure they understood the full scope of his espionage activities. They chose surveillance. A small team of FBI agents was assigned to monitor Hanssen's activities 24 hours a day. His home was placed under surveillance. His FBI office was secretly searched, and investigators discovered classified documents hidden in his desk that he had no authorized reason to possess. His computer was examined, revealing encrypted files and evidence of unauthorized access to classified databases. The FBI developed an elaborate plan to keep Hanssen under close observation while building an airtight case against him. In mid-January 2001, approximately 1 month before his arrest, Hanssen was given a new assignment within the FBI, one that the Bureau's leadership had deliberately created as part of their investigative strategy. He was transferred to a newly created position in the FBI's Information Assurance Office and was assigned to prepare a report on the Bureau's internal security measures. The assignment seemed plausible. It fit Hanssen's background in computer security, but its real purpose was to move him into an office where surveillance would be easier and where his activities could be monitored more closely. The FBI assigned a young employee named Eric O'Neill to work as Hanssen's assistant in this new office. O'Neill, who was in his 20s and relatively new to the FBI, was told that Hanssen was under investigation for sexual deviance related to his computer usage. In reality, O'Neill's assignment was to monitor Hanssen constantly, to document his activities, to search for evidence, and to report everything to the investigation team. O'Neill spent weeks working alongside Hanssen, maintaining the fiction that he was simply a junior employee learning from a senior agent, while actually watching for any sign that Hanssen was preparing for another dead drop operation or destroying evidence. The assignment placed O'Neill in an extraordinarily difficult position. He had to appear friendly and admiring toward a man he knew was a traitor, had to hide his own nervousness and suspicion, and had to find opportunities to search Hanssen's belongings and computer without being detected. Hanssen accepted the assignment and O'Neill's presence without apparent suspicion. He began working in his new office, unaware that virtually everything he did, his computer usage, his phone calls, his movements, was being monitored and documented by the investigation team working around the clock to build their case. The FBI's surveillance documented that Hanssen was preparing for another dead drop operation. He had retrieved classified documents from various sources and had prepared them for delivery. On the afternoon of February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen left his home in Vienna, Virginia, and drove toward Foxstone Park, a location he had used for dead drops several times during his 22 years of espionage. The FBI's arrest plan was carefully choreographed. More than 40 agents were positioned in and around Foxstone Park. Some were dressed as joggers, others as people walking dogs, others in vehicles that seemed to be simply parked. The goal was to catch Hanssen in the act of servicing the dead drop, to document him placing the package, to seize the package, and to arrest him in a way that left no room for him to deny what he was doing or to claim he had been framed. At approximately 3:32 p.m., Robert Hanssen parked his sedan in the parking area near Foxstone Park. He exited his vehicle and opened the trunk. FBI agents watching from various positions confirmed that he removed a package wrapped in black plastic. He then began walking along a path that led into the wooded area of the park. Hanssen walked for approximately 7 minutes, following a route that FBI agents recognized from their study of his previous dead drop operations. He reached a wooden footbridge that crossed a small creek. He stopped on the bridge, looked around as if checking for any observers, and then knelt down. He placed the package underneath the bridge, securing it in a location where it would not be visible to casual passers-by, but where someone who knew where to look could retrieve it. As Hanssen stood up and began to walk away from the bridge, FBI agents emerged from concealment. The first agent to approach identified himself and told Hanssen he was under arrest. Hanssen's reaction, as described by multiple agents who were present, was one of resignation rather than surprise. He did not resist. He did not claim innocence or mistake. According to some accounts, Hanssen asked, "What took you so long?" Though this quote has been disputed by some who were present, the question, whether he actually said it or not, would be interpreted by FBI investigators as revealing something about Hanssen's psychology. It suggested that he had, on some level, been expecting to be caught, that perhaps he had even wanted to be caught, that the tension of maintaining his double life for 22 years had become unsustainable. Hanssen was taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported to the FBI's Washington field office. The package he had left under the bridge was retrieved. It contained 7 classified documents that detailed FBI and CIA counterintelligence operations, technical surveillance capabilities, and information about Russian intelligence officers who were cooperating with the United States. While Hanssen was being processed at the FBI facility, other agents went to his home in Vienna to inform Bonnie Hanssen that her husband had been arrested and to execute a search warrant. Bonnie's reaction, according to the agent's reports, was shock and disbelief. She insisted that there must be some mistake, that Robert would never betray his country, that he was a devoted Catholic and a patriot. When agents explained the evidence against him, and including the fact that this was not the first time that he had been spying since 1979 with only a brief interruption, Bonnie became distraught. She had believed for 20 years that the 1980 incident was an isolated mistake that Robert had corrected. The realization that he had deceived her for decades, that he had resumed his espionage and had continued it throughout their marriage while she raised their children and built her life around trust in him, was devastating. The Hanssen children, 6 in total, ranging in age from their early 30s to their teens, learned of their father's arrest through a combination of FBI notification and media coverage. The arrest was announced publicly on February 20, 2001, 2 days after Hanssen was taken into custody. The announcement described Hanssen as a 25-year FBI veteran who had been spying for Russia and the former Soviet Union for more than 15 years. The actual length of his espionage, 22 years, would emerge later as the investigation progressed. The media coverage was extensive and sensational. Headlines described Hanssen as one of the most damaging spies in American history, drawing comparisons to Aldrich Ames and to the atomic spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Reporters identified the Hanssen family's home in Vienna, and television crews camped outside, filming the house and attempting to interview neighbors. The Hanssen children, some of whom still lived in the area, found themselves unable to avoid the scrutiny. Co-workers, friends, and neighbors recognized the family name and made the connection. The impact on the Hanssen children was profound. The older children, who had already established independent lives, experienced shock, shame, and anger. Some of them refused to have any further contact with their father. The younger children, who were still living at home or were in college, struggled to reconcile their memories of their father, who had been involved in their religious education, who had taken them to church, who had emphasized moral behavior, with the reality of what he had done for more than 2 decades. One of the daughters would later describe to family friends the impossible task of explaining to her own children why their grandfather was in prison. Another spoke of changing her last name to escape the association. The youngest, still a teenager when his father was arrested, struggled with depression and anger, feeling that his entire childhood had been a lie constructed around a father who never actually existed. Bonnie Hanssen, at 54 years old, faced the collapse of everything she had believed about her husband and her marriage. She cooperated with FBI investigators, providing information about family finances, about Robert's habits and movements, and about the 1980 incident when she had first discovered his espionage. She maintained that she had no knowledge of his activities after 1980 and that she had believed his assurance that the matter was resolved. FBI investigators concluded that her claims were credible. There was no evidence that she had knowingly assisted or been aware of his espionage beyond the initial discovery in 1980. The legal proceedings against Robert Hanssen moved quickly. He was initially charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, but prosecutors indicated their intention to file additional charges that could carry the death penalty. Hanssen was represented by defense attorneys who advised him that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that his best option was to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a plea agreement that would spare his life. Over the following months, Hanssen participated in extensive debriefing sessions with FBI and CIA investigators. The debriefings were designed to accomplish several goals: to determine exactly what information Hanssen had compromised over his 22 years of espionage, to understand his methods and motivations, to identify any potential accomplices or co-conspirators, and to assess the full damage to U.S. national security. Hanssen's cooperation during these debriefings was described by investigators as technically accurate but emotionally detached. He provided detailed information about the documents he had stolen and delivered, the dead drop locations he had used, his methods for encrypting communications, and his techniques for avoiding detection. He acknowledged the deaths of the 3 executed sources: Dmitri Polyakov, Sergei Motorin, and Valery Martynov. But according to investigators, he showed little emotional response when discussing these consequences. When asked why he had committed espionage, Hanssen offered explanations that emphasized his intellectual superiority, his financial motivations, and his belief that his activities had not truly harmed U.S. security, because the Soviets and Russians would have eventually obtained much of the same information through other means. Psychiatrists who evaluated Hanssen as part of the legal proceedings diagnosed him with personality disorders characterized by narcissism, lack of empathy, and grandiosity. They noted his need to feel superior to those around him, his absence of genuine remorse for the people he had harmed, and his inability to understand why his actions were morally wrong rather than simply illegal. The psychiatric reports described a man who could articulate intellectually that he had violated laws and caused harm, but who could not connect emotionally to the human consequences of his choices. He understood that Polyakov, Motorin, and Martynov had been executed, but he showed no evidence of feeling guilt or responsibility for their deaths. He acknowledged that he had betrayed his colleagues and his country, but he framed this betrayal in terms of a game he had played skillfully for 22 years, rather than as a moral failure. The psychiatrists concluded that Hanssen was legally competent to stand trial and to understand the proceedings against him, but they also noted that his personality disorders had likely played a significant role in his decision to commit espionage, and in his ability to maintain that espionage for more than 2 decades without experiencing debilitating guilt. On July 6, 2001, Robert Hanssen entered a guilty plea in federal district court to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. As part of the plea agreement, he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, to submit to polygraph examinations, and to be debriefed about his espionage activities. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and to recommend a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Additionally, the plea agreement included provisions that allowed Bonnie Hanssen to retain part of Robert's FBI pension, approximately $39,000 per year, which she would need to support herself, given that she had not worked outside the home for decades and had no independent income. The decision to allow Bonnie to retain pension benefits was controversial. Some argued that she should not benefit financially from her husband's espionage, even indirectly through his pension. Others argued that she was an innocent victim of her husband's crimes, and that she had cooperated with investigators, and that denying her the pension would punish her for crimes she did not commit. The Justice Department ultimately decided that allowing her to retain the pension was appropriate given her cooperation and her lack of involvement in the espionage. On May 10, 2002, Robert Hanssen was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Judge Claude M. Hilton, who presided over the sentencing hearing, heard testimony from multiple parties. Prosecutors presented evidence of the damage Hanssen's espionage had caused, the deaths of intelligence sources, the compromise of operations that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars, the betrayal of trust that had undermined the morale of intelligence officers who had risked their lives to serve their country. Defense attorneys presented arguments about Hanssen's cooperation, his psychological disorders, and the benefit to the United States of his debriefings. Bonnie Hanssen attended the sentencing but did not testify. None of the Hanssen children were present. Judge Hilton, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the complexity of the case, but emphasized the extraordinary damage that Hanssen's espionage had caused. He noted that Hanssen had betrayed not only his country, but also his colleagues who had trusted him, the sources who had died because of information he provided, and his own family who had been deceived for decades. He described Hanssen's crimes as among the most serious violations of the public trust possible in a democratic society. He imposed the maximum sentence available under the plea agreement, life in prison without any possibility of parole or release. Robert Hanssen was initially incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. In 2002, he was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, a maximum security facility designed for the most dangerous and high-profile inmates. A DX Florence, often called Supermax, operates under extreme restrictions. Inmates are confined to their cells for approximately 23 hours per day, have minimal human contact, and have virtually no communication with the outside world except through monitored correspondence and rare visits. Hanssen's conditions of confinement at ADX Florence were particularly severe, even by that facility's standards. He was housed in a special unit for high-security inmates, or had no access to other inmates, and had no opportunity for work or educational programs. His only regular human contact came from guards who delivered meals and from occasional medical staff. According to reports from people familiar with the facility, Hanssen spent his time reading, particularly religious materials, and writing letters, though his correspondence was heavily monitored and restricted. Bonnie Hanssen visited her husband occasionally during the first few years of his incarceration, though the logistics of travel to Colorado and the restrictions on visits made frequent contact difficult. According to people familiar with the family, these visits became less frequent over time. Bonnie remained deeply religious and, according to statements she made to her spiritual advisors, struggled to reconcile her Catholic faith's emphasis on forgiveness with her anger and sense of betrayal at Robert's deception. She continued to live quietly, receiving the pension that kept her financially stable, participating in Opus Dei activities, and avoiding all public attention. The Hanssen children's relationships with their father varied widely. Some refused all contact, choosing to treat him as if he had died on the day of his arrest. Others maintained minimal contact through occasional letters that focused on practical matters, health issues, legal questions, family deaths, rather than on emotional reconciliation. At least one of the children visited him in prison during the first few years of his incarceration, though according to reports, these visits were strained and ultimately ceased. Several children changed their names to distance themselves from the Hanssen identity. Others moved to different parts of the country to escape recognition. All of them, by every account, carried the burden of being Robert Hanssen's children, a burden that affected their relationships, their careers, their sense of identity, and their ability to trust others. The FBI's internal investigation into how Hanssen had been able to operate undetected for 22 years led to significant reforms in the Bureau's security procedures. The investigation identified multiple failures that had allowed Hanssen to betray his country for more than 2 decades. Hanssen had never been subjected to a polygraph examination during his 25 years with the FBI, despite working in sensitive counterintelligence positions. The FBI implemented mandatory regular polygraph examinations for all employees with access to highly classified information. Hanssen's financial situation had shown anomalies. He had more cash available than his salary alone would explain. But because FBI employees were not required to submit to regular financial reviews, these anomalies had never been investigated. The FBI implemented requirements for financial disclosure statements and random financial reviews for employees in sensitive positions. Hanssen had been able to access classified information from databases and files that were not directly related to his current assignments, and no one had questioned why he was accessing this material. The FBI implemented more rigorous tracking of database access and required justification for any access to classified information outside an employee's direct area of responsibility. Hanssen's work computers had contained encrypted files and evidence of unauthorized activity, but the FBI's computer security systems had not detected or flagged this activity. The FBI significantly upgraded its computer security infrastructure and implemented more sophisticated monitoring systems. The CIA, which had its own history of internal espionage with the Aldrich Ames case in the 1990s, also conducted reviews of its security procedures in light of the Hanssen case. Both agencies recognized that the insider threat, the possibility that a trusted employee with legitimate access could betray that trust, was among the most difficult security challenges to address because it required balancing security measures against the operational need for employees to have access to information. The damage assessment prepared by the FBI and CIA in the years following Hanssen's arrest concluded that his espionage represented one of the worst intelligence failures in U.S. history. The assessment, portions of which remain classified, identified several categories of damage that extended far beyond simple statistics. The human cost was measured not just in the 3 confirmed executions, but in the families destroyed. Dmitri Polyakov's wife and children were persecuted by Soviet authorities after his arrest. They were stripped of their apartment, their privileges, their ability to work in professional positions. Polyakov's son was expelled from university. His wife was subjected to interrogations in which KGB officers demanded she explain how she could have been married to a traitor without knowing. The family lived under constant surveillance for years. Similar fates befell the families of Motorin and Martynov. These families had no role in their relatives' decisions to work for American intelligence, but they bore consequences nonetheless. The operational cost included hundreds of millions of dollars in compromised technical operations. The tunnel under the Soviet embassy represented just one example. Satellite surveillance programs, encrypted communications systems, and human intelligence operations were all compromised by information Hanssen provided. Each compromised operation required American intelligence agencies to develop new capabilities, invest in new technologies, and rebuild relationships with foreign intelligence services who had trusted American security. The strategic cost involved the advantage Soviet and Russian intelligence gained from understanding American capabilities and limitations. This allowed them to operate more effectively, to protect their own secrets more successfully, and to deceive American intelligence in areas where they knew the Americans had vulnerabilities. The institutional cost damaged morale within the FBI and the broader intelligence community. Intelligence officers who had risked their lives or careers to gather information felt betrayed by the knowledge that their work had been systematically compromised by someone who should have been protecting it. The case also made recruitment of foreign intelligence sources more difficult. Potential sources needed to be convinced that the U.S. intelligence services could protect them, and the Hanssen case demonstrated that such protection could not be guaranteed. In 2007, the film Breach, directed by Billy Ray and starring Chris Cooper as Hanssen and Ryan Philippe as Eric O'Neill, brought renewed public attention to the case. The film portrayed Hanssen as intelligent, deeply religious, psychologically complex, and ultimately pathetic, a man whose intelligence and capabilities were undermined by his moral failures and his psychological needs. The film focused on the final weeks before Hanssen's arrest, showing O'Neill's assignment to monitor him and the cat-and-mouse dynamic between the young FBI employee who knew his subject was a traitor and the veteran agent who suspected nothing. The film was generally well-reviewed and was noted for avoiding the sensationalism that often characterizes espionage films. Instead, it presented a nuanced portrait of Hanssen as someone who was neither a cartoonish villain nor an ideologically committed traitor, but rather a complicated individual whose mixture of intelligence, arrogance, resentment, and psychological disorder led him to betray his country while maintaining the external appearance of devotion to it. Bonnie Hanssen and the Hanssen children declined to participate in the film's production or to comment on its portrayal of their family. In February 2020, news reports indicated that Robert Hanssen, then 75 years old, was in declining health at ADX Florence. Prison officials confirmed that he was receiving medical care but provided no specific details about his condition. Bonnie Hanssen, then 72 years old, was reportedly living quietly in the Washington, D.C. area, still receiving the pension that had been preserved under the plea agreement. She had maintained her Catholic faith and continued to participate in Opus Dei activities, though she had become even more private and reclusive than she had been before her husband's arrest. On June 5, 2023, the Federal Bureau of Prisons announced that Robert Philip Hanssen had been found dead in his cell at ADX Florence. He was 79 years old. According to the official statement, Hanssen appeared to have died of natural causes, though an autopsy would be conducted to confirm. The death occurred approximately 22 years after his arrest, the same length of time he had spent committing espionage. News of Hanssen's death received moderate media coverage, with most outlets providing summaries of his espionage activities and the damage he had caused. Several retired FBI agents who had worked counterintelligence during Hanssen's era were quoted expressing relief that he had died in prison and would never be released. The Russian government made no official comment on his death, though Russian media outlets that cover intelligence matters noted his passing and described him as having been one of Russia's most valuable intelligence sources during the 1980s and 1990s. Bonnie Hanssen was notified of her husband's death by Bureau of Prisons officials. She arranged for his body to be released for burial and organized a small private funeral service. According to reports, the funeral was attended only by Bonnie and a few family members. Several of the Hanssen children chose not to attend. Robert Hanssen was buried in a cemetery in the Washington, D.C. area. His gravestone, according to people who have seen it, bears only his name and his birth and death dates. No epitaph, no indication of his career or his crimes, nothing to suggest who he had been or what he had done. Understanding Robert Hanssen's life and his choices requires grappling with contradictions that resist simple resolution. Unlike some spies who were motivated by clear ideological convictions, who believed they were serving a cause larger than themselves, Hanssen was motivated by a mixture of factors that were both more personal and less coherent. He wanted money, but he did not live lavishly or display wealth. He resented his colleagues and supervisors, but he continued working at the FBI rather than leaving for a different career. He claimed to be deeply religious and committed to Catholic moral teaching, but he systematically betrayed his country, deceived his wife, and caused the deaths of people who had trusted American intelligence services to protect them. The psychiatrists who evaluated Hanssen concluded that his personality disorders, particularly his narcissism and his need to feel superior, were central to understanding his behavior. He needed to believe he was smarter than everyone around him, and his espionage served as proof of that superiority. Every dead drop he serviced without being caught, every piece of classified information he provided without triggering an investigation, every year that passed without detection reinforced his belief in his own cleverness. The fact that the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, the very organization he was betraying, employed him to work on cases related to Russian intelligence operations was particularly satisfying to his sense of superiority. But intellectual narcissism alone does not fully explain Hanssen's choices. The context in which Hanssen operated also mattered. The security weaknesses that had allowed him to operate for so long, the absence of regular polygraph examinations, the lack of financial oversight, the inadequate monitoring of database access, and the culture that discouraged questioning the loyalty of long-serving employees, all created an environment in which someone with Hanssen's knowledge and access could operate with relative impunity for more than 2 decades. Moreover, the nature of Hanssen's work, Soviet and Russian counterintelligence, meant that he was constantly engaged with exactly the kind of deception and manipulation that his espionage required. He recruited sources, ran double-agent operations, analyzed intelligence from human and technical sources, and thought continuously about how Soviet and Russian intelligence operated. This work both provided him with the knowledge necessary to conduct his own espionage and may have desensitized him to the moral dimensions of betrayal. The impact on the victims of Hanssen's espionage extended far beyond those who died. American intelligence officers who had worked with the 3 executed sources felt the weight of their deaths. The knowledge that someone within their own organization had betrayed the people they had promised to protect. The FBI agents who had worked alongside Hanssen for years felt a different kind of betrayal. They had trusted him as a colleague, had included him in sensitive discussions, had relied on his expertise. The discovery that he had been a spy the entire time forced them to question their own judgment and to wonder what other signs they might have missed. For Bonnie Hanssen and her children, the betrayal was perhaps the most profound, because it was both professional and deeply personal. Robert had not only betrayed his country, he had betrayed his family. He had deceived Bonnie for decades, had exposed his children to risk and shame, and had destroyed any possibility of his family maintaining normal relationships with their community or with each other. The damage was not limited to the period of his arrest and imprisonment, but extended into every year that followed, affecting the children's ability to form trusting relationships, Bonnie's sense of identity and worth, and the family's basic ability to function. Bonnie's responsibility, or lack thereof, presents its own complications. She discovered her husband's espionage in 1980 and chose not to report it to authorities. She required him to confess to a priest and believed that he had stopped his espionage activities. Should she have done more? Should she have reported him despite the consequences for her family? The Catholic teaching on the sanctity of marriage and the duty of a wife to support her husband, which Bonnie took extremely seriously, created a framework in which keeping the secret seemed like a religious and moral obligation. But that framework existed alongside another obligation, the civic duty to report serious crimes and threats to national security. Bonnie's decision not to report the 1980 incident might be understood as an impossible choice between 2 incompatible obligations, all made by someone who had limited understanding of the intelligence world, who trusted her husband's claim that it was over, and who believed that religious confession and repentance were sufficient response to sin. That this belief proved tragically wrong does not necessarily mean her decision was unreasonable given what she knew and believed at the time. However, it does mean that her silence facilitated 15 additional years of espionage, from 1985, when Robert resumed his activities, until 2001, when he was arrested. Years during which secrets were stolen, operations were compromised, and lives were lost. The broader challenge raised by the Hanssen case is how democratic societies can protect themselves against the insider threat without becoming surveillance states that trust no one. The security measures implemented after Hanssen's arrest, polygraphs, financial reviews, database access monitoring, restrictions on information sharing, all serve legitimate security purposes. But they also create an environment of suspicion, where employees in sensitive positions must constantly prove their loyalty, where normal financial decisions require explanation, and where trust is replaced by verification. This tension between security and liberty, between protection and privacy, between trust and verification, has no perfect resolution. Hanssen was caught not by these security measures, but by a fortunate break: a Russian intelligence officer deciding to sell his file to the United States. Had that sale not occurred, Hanssen might have continued his espionage for several more years, perhaps until his retirement from the FBI. The security reforms implemented after his arrest might prevent future Hanssens, or they might simply force future spies to be more careful, or they might identify innocent people whose behaviors appear suspicious but who are not actually engaged in espionage. Robert Hanssen was 35 years old when he first made contact with Soviet intelligence in 1979. He was 56 when he was arrested in 2001. He was 79 when he died in prison in 2023. The years between encompassed the entirety of his adult life: his marriage, the raising of his 6 children, his career at the FBI, and his parallel career as a spy. For 44 years, from his first contact with Soviet intelligence until his death, his life was defined by espionage, or by the consequences of espionage. And the damage rippled outward to Dmitri Polyakov, shot by firing squad in 1988 after providing intelligence to the United States for nearly 20 years, to Sergei Motorin and Valery Martynov, executed in the basement of Lubyanka prison, to their wives and children who suffered persecution for crimes they did not commit, to the FBI agents who spent millions of dollars and years of work building a tunnel under the Soviet embassy, only to have it compromised, to the intelligence officers who worked alongside Hanssen and trusted him, to Bonnie, who spent 20 years believing her husband had repented for a mistake he was actually repeating almost weekly, to the 6 Hanssen children who lost their father first to a lie and then to a prison cell, and who will carry the burden of his name and his choices for the rest of their lives. The photograph of Robert Hanssen that became iconic after his arrest shows him in his FBI identification badge photo, a middle-aged man with glasses, thinning hair, a slight smile, wearing a suit and tie. He looks like thousands of other government employees who work in offices in Washington, D.C. There is nothing in the photograph that suggests what he was doing, no visible sign of the moral compromise or the systematic betrayal. That ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect, that someone who looked so conventional, who maintained such a careful facade of normalcy and even religiosity, could for decades engage in activities that resulted in deaths, compromised critical intelligence operations, and destroyed the lives of people who trusted him. The Hanssen case stands as a reminder that espionage is not only conducted by exotic figures meeting in dark alleys or by ideologically committed true believers. It is also conducted by people who seem mundane, who live in suburbs, who take their children to church, who perform their jobs competently, and who maintain successful deceptions for decades. Understanding how and why such people make the choices they make, how systems fail to detect them, and how to prevent future cases without creating environments of universal suspicion remains one of the most difficult challenges for intelligence agencies and for the societies they serve. Robert Hanssen is dead. The Cold War that provided the context for much of his espionage ended more than 30 years ago. The Soviet Union, whose intelligence service he first contacted, no longer exists. The specific secrets he provided have long since been superseded by technological and strategic changes, but the tensions his case illuminates, about loyalty and betrayal, about trust and verification, about the relationship between individual choices and systemic failures, about how ordinary people can do extraordinarily damaging things, remain unresolved and urgent in ways that transcend any single case or any particular era.